When I think about my childhood, English was nowhere to be found. Not in my home, not in my neighborhood, not in my dreams. I grew up in a small place, a place where mornings were slow and evenings felt familiar. People knew each other. Voices were warm. Faces were recognizable. Life moved at a gentle pace. As a child, my world was simple. School, home, the streets around my house. I didn't think about the future. I didn't think about languages. I only knew the sounds that surrounded me. The language spoken by my parents, by my friends, by the shopkeepers who greeted us every day. English felt like something from another planet. It appeared occasionally, on old textbooks, on signs I couldn't read, on television programs that felt distant. I didn't understand it, and I didn't try to. English belonged to a different world, a world that felt far away from my own. At school, English was just a subject, a page in a book, words printed in unfamiliar shapes, pronunciations written in strange symbols. We memorized, we repeated, but we didn't use it. English stayed inside the classroom. It never followed me home. When the bell rang, English disappeared. Outside, life returned to what felt real. I remember feeling no connection to it, no curiosity, no resistance, just distance. English was not difficult. It was irrelevant. At that time, my identity was deeply rooted in my surroundings, in the stories my grandparents told, in the traditions we followed without questioning, in the food, the festivals, the shared history. Everything felt complete. I didn't feel that I was missing anything. The idea that one day English would matter never crossed my mind. As I grew older, my world expanded slightly. I learned more, I read more, I watched more. English appeared more often, but still, it stayed on the surface. I could recognize words, I could guess meanings, but it never became part of me. I treated it like background noise, something present but unimportant. Deep down, I believed English was for others, for people who lived abroad, for people with different lives, different opportunities, not for someone like me. That belief was quiet, but strong. It shaped my attitude without me realizing it. I never imagined myself using English to express who I was, my thoughts, my culture, my identity. English felt too foreign for that, and my own language felt enough. Looking back, I realize something now. It wasn't that English was difficult. It was that English felt disconnected from who I was. It didn't reflect my reality. It didn't carry my memories. It didn't tell my story, so I ignored it. I didn't hate it. I simply didn't invite it into my life. Years passed. Life changed. Responsibilities grew. The world became larger. And slowly, English stopped being distant. It started appearing in important places, in job requirements, in professional conversations, in opportunities that felt just out of reach. At first, I resisted that reality. I told myself I could survive without it, that my skills were enough, that my experience would speak for me. But the world was changing, and I was changing with it. Even then, English still felt separate from my identity. I approached it with caution, with formality, as something to learn, not something to live. I studied rules, I memorized vocabulary, but there was no connection, no emotion, no meaning. It felt mechanical, and mechanical learning never lasts. I didn't understand this at the time. I only knew that English felt heavy, not because it was hard, but because it felt empty. There was no story behind it, no personal reason, no emotional bridge. I was learning words without context, sentences without life, and that made everything feel forced. Whenever I tried to speak, my voice hesitated, not because I didn't know the words, but because I didn't know who I was in that language. English didn't sound like me. It didn't feel like home. So I stayed quiet. I stayed safe inside the language I knew. inside the identity I was comfortable with. I didn't realize that avoiding English was also avoiding growth, avoiding connection, avoiding the possibility of sharing my world with others. At that stage, English was still just a tool, cold, distant, impersonal. It hadn't touched my heart yet, and without that connection, nothing could truly begin. One evening, as I walked through my hometown, I noticed how familiar everything felt. The streets, the sounds, the people. I felt grounded, rooted. And for the first time, a question surfaced quietly in my mind. What happens when my world meets the world beyond this place? That question didn't bring excitement. It brought uncertainty. Because beyond my hometown, beyond my culture, beyond my language, English was waiting, and I wasn't ready. I didn't know then that this distance between who I was and what English represented would eventually disappear. I didn't know that English would one day become a bridge, not away from my identity, but deeper into it. At that moment, English was still a stranger, a distant sound, a language with no face, no memory, no place in my story. But that was about to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, through experience, through connection, through life itself. And that journey was only just beginning. The first time English touched my life was not in a classroom. It happened quietly, almost by accident. I was older then, no longer a child, no longer protected by the small world I grew up in. Life had expanded, work, responsibilities, new people, and with them, new expectations. English appeared not as a subject, but as a requirement. Emails arrived in English, documents, instructions, messages. At first I treated them carefully. I read slowly, I translated in my head, I checked every word. English felt formal, distant, like a language that did not belong to me. I could understand enough to survive, but I avoided using it to express myself, especially when it came to who I was. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. I met someone new, a foreign colleague, a visitor, a traveler. We exchanged greetings, simple words. Then came a question. "Where are you from?" It was an easy question. I had answered it many times before, but this time it was in English. I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't know how to say it in that language. How do you explain your hometown to someone who has never seen it? How do you describe the places that shaped you? The smells, the sounds, the traditions. I searched for words, simple ones. This is my hometown. It is small. It is quiet. The sentences sounded flat, incomplete. They didn't carry what I felt. I realized something in that moment. English was not just a tool for communication. It was a mirror. It showed me how limited my expression was outside my own language. For the first time, I felt the distance between who I was and what I could express, not in a painful way, but in an honest one. That conversation didn't last long, but it stayed with me. Later that night, I thought about it, about how easily I could describe my hometown in my own language, with emotion, with detail, and how difficult it felt to do the same in English. It wasn't about vocabulary. It was about connection. English didn't yet carry my memories. It didn't know my stories. So my words felt empty. That realization changed how I saw English. It was no longer just a foreign language. It was a space where my identity had not yet entered, and that space felt uncomfortable, but also interesting. I began noticing English in new ways, in documentaries, in interviews, in travel videos. People used English to talk about their cultures, their food, their families, their history. They spoke with accents. They made mistakes. But their stories felt alive. That surprised me. English didn't erase their identity. It carried it. That idea challenged an old belief. I had believed that English was something separate, something foreign, something that belonged to others. Now I saw it differently. English was a bridge, not away from who you are, but toward others. Slowly, my curiosity grew. Not about grammar, not about rules, about expression. How do I talk about my culture in English? How do I explain what matters to me? How do I tell my story to someone from a different world? Those questions felt personal. For the first time, English felt relevant. I didn't rush to study. I didn't open textbooks. I started listening to stories. People talking about their lives, their childhood, their hometowns, their traditions. I listened to how they described simple things. A meal, a memory, a place. I noticed they didn't use complicated language. They used feeling, tone, pauses, emotion. That was new to me. I realized I didn't need perfect English to be understood. I needed honest English. That realization was both freeing and frightening, because honesty requires exposure, and exposure was what I had avoided for years. Still, something inside me had shifted. English was no longer just an obligation. It was an opportunity to step outside my familiar identity, not to replace it, but to expand it. I began practicing in my own way, not memorizing, not repeating sentences without meaning. I tried to describe my hometown out loud, the streets, the people, the feeling of home. At first, my sentences were broken. I paused often. I searched for words, but I continued. I wasn't practicing English. I was practicing being myself in English. That felt different. It felt vulnerable, but it felt real. For the first time, English was not empty. It carried something of mine, a memory, a feeling, a piece of identity. That was the moment English stopped being distant. It still felt unfamiliar, but it was no longer a stranger. It was becoming a place where my story could exist, and that realization opened a new door, not to fluency, but to meaning. A door that would soon lead me into deeper conversations, real interactions, moments where English would no longer stay at the surface, but would become a bridge between my world and someone else's. And that was both exciting and terrifying. But this time I didn't turn away. I leaned in, quietly, curiously, knowing that something important was beginning to take shape. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. English didn't change all at once. It changed through small moments, ordinary moments, conversations that were not planned, questions that were not rehearsed. One day, I found myself talking about food, not in my own language, in English. Someone asked what people eat where I come from. It sounded simple, but as I answered, something unexpected happened. I wasn't translating. I was remembering. The smell of meals my family cooked, the sound of plates during gatherings, the feeling of sitting together at the end of a long day. My English was imperfect. I paused often. I searched for words. But the meaning was clear. The person listening was interested. They asked more questions. And I kept talking. That moment stayed with me. Because for the first time, English carried my memories. Not just information, emotion. After that, similar moments appeared. People asked about my hometown, about traditions, about celebrations, about daily life. Each time I felt nervous. Each time I stayed. I learned something important. When you talk about what you know deeply, language becomes secondary. Connection comes first. I noticed how people listened, not to my grammar, but to my story. They didn't interrupt when I paused. They waited. They leaned in. That patience gave me courage. I realized that communication is not about speed. It is about intention. Slowly, I stopped hiding behind short answers. I explained more. I described feelings. I shared small details. My sentences were simple, but they were honest. And honesty is powerful. English became a bridge, not a test, not a performance, a bridge between my world and someone else's. That changed how I approached conversations. I stopped preparing perfect sentences. I prepared presence. I listened carefully. I responded honestly. If I didn't know a word, I described it. If I felt unsure, I slowed down. I learned to trust the listener, to trust the moment. That trust made everything lighter. I also noticed how English changed how I saw my own culture. Explaining traditions to others made me reflect. Why do we do things the way we do? What do these rituals mean? What values do they carry? English didn't erase my identity. It helped me understand it better. I saw my culture through fresh eyes, through questions I had never asked myself. That perspective felt enriching, not threatening. I began to enjoy these exchanges, not because I sounded good, but because I felt connected. English was no longer something I endured. It was something I used to share who I was. There were still awkward moments, times when words escaped me, times when I misunderstood. But those moments felt smaller now. They no longer defined me. They were part of the flow. I learned to smile, to laugh, to continue. And people responded with warmth. Not correction, not judgment. Warmth. That changed how I felt inside. I felt more open, more relaxed, more myself. English stopped being a separate skill. It became part of my voice, not perfect, but authentic. One evening, after a long conversation, I reflected on how far I had come, not in fluency, but in comfort. I remembered how distant English once felt, how empty, how irrelevant. And now it carried stories, memories, pieces of who I was. I realized that English had done something I never expected. It didn't pull me away from my roots. It allowed me to share them, to carry my culture into conversations with people from different places. That realization felt grounding. It gave English meaning. And when something has meaning, it no longer feels heavy. It feels alive. I didn't know it then, but this phase, this period of real connection, was preparing me for a deeper understanding. An understanding that English was never just about language. It was about belonging, about being seen, about allowing myself to exist in more than one world. And that understanding would soon change how I saw myself. Not just as someone who learned English, but as someone who found a larger voice through it. Looking back now, I understand something clearly. English did not change who I was. It revealed who I had always been. For a long time, I believed language was about correctness, about rules, about fluency, about sounding right. But living with English taught me something else. Language is about presence, about showing up, about staying when things feel uncertain. I used to think I needed to be confident before I spoke. Now I know confidence comes after. It grows through small moments of courage, moments that rarely feel dramatic, moments that often feel uncomfortable. English taught me to stay with that discomfort, to breathe, to pause, to continue. And in doing so, it changed how I approached life. I became more patient with myself, with others, with the process of learning. I stopped rushing to become someone else. I started listening to who I already was. When I made mistakes, I didn't shrink anymore. I stayed. I learned that mistakes are not interruptions. They are part of the conversation. They show that something real is happening. English also taught me to let go of control. I couldn't plan every sentence. I couldn't predict every response. I had to trust the moment. And that trust extended beyond language. It entered my work, my relationships, my daily interactions. I became less guarded, more open, more willing to be seen as I was, not as I wanted to appear. The most surprising lesson was this. English did not pull me away from my identity, it brought me closer to it. By explaining my culture to others, I understood it better myself. By sharing my stories, I honored where I came from. English became a way to carry my roots into the wider world, not to replace them, but to share them. Today, English is part of my life, not as a challenge, but as a companion. Some days, I speak with ease. Other days, I search for words. Both are fine. I no longer measure myself by fluency. I measure myself by willingness. Willingness to speak. Willingness to connect. Willingness to stay present. If you are listening to this and you feel hesitant, if English still feels distant, I want you to remember this. You do not need to sound perfect to be understood. You do not need to know everything to begin. Your story already exists. English is simply one way to let it travel. Take it slowly. Let the language enter your life the way life enters a room. Quietly, naturally, without force. You don't have to leave who you are behind. Bring yourself with you. Your accent, your pauses, your memories. They are not obstacles. They are your voice. And one day, without noticing exactly when, you will realize English no longer feels foreign. It feels lived in, like a place where your story has found a home. Thank you for staying with this journey, for listening, for reflecting. And if there is one thing to carry forward, let it be this. Learning a language is not about becoming someone new. It is about allowing more of yourself to be heard. Quietly, honestly, one conversation at a time.